Greetings, everybody. Chris Islip from the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Academic World Quest 2023 preparation. Students across Montana and across the United States are preparing for this spring's International Knowledge Competition, Academic World Quest. And to help them, we're talking with experts across the 9 of the 10 fields and themes that will be part and parcel of the Academic World Quest competition in the spring. To kick things off, I'd like to ask our partner, Irina Karmanova at the U.S. Department of State, to run a short video on the U.S. State Department. Irina, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. We're happy to be here and bring you a series of speakers for your students. If you'd like to know more about the State Department, visit state.gov. But in the meantime, I'll play a 1-minute long video to get everyone excited to learn more.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
So thank you for watching that, and I'll turn it over back to you guys.
Thank you very much, Irina, and thanks to the U.S. Department of State, our key partner in several episodes of this series. If you're interested in the U.S. Department of State, you can check them out on the web, and you can join us in February for our International Careers Week, where we'll look more in depth on careers overseas, including those with the State Department. So with no further ado, let me introduce today's guest. Dr. Corey Watts is a veterinarian working at the nexus of public health, animal production, and trade. She currently serves as an agricultural advisor in the Office of Agricultural Policy at the Department of State. Prior to her current position, Corey contributed her research expertise to a diverse set of food safety projects in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. She's passionate about using science-based approaches to improve food security, enhance farmer livelihood, and grow economies while also protecting U.S. trade interests. Dr. Watts, greetings. How are you?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm doing well. Thank you. Good to see you today.
We're so glad that you could join us, Corey. Now, we're going to talk food security, and I'll just throw this one at you that oftentimes when we hear the word security, we are thinking about things like uniforms, barbed wire, and weapons and things like this. My trick knee tells me that that's not the case when we're talking about food security. Could you help our Montana students understand what is meant by food security and how that affects them?
Absolutely. And I think there's a reason we use the word security. It relates to the individual's security and ability to live and achieve their full potential. But it also, we see it tying into our national security priorities. When you look at food insecurity in certain regions around the world, you do see that both effects on our American farmers, but also potential areas of unrest that we need to worry about. So all of these things are tied in together. When you want to define food insecurity, you look to, at least I look to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO, which has, if you want to dig in a little further, some great definitions, different types, be it acute or chronic food insecurity. There's also the IPC But what I really want to stress is that we are in a global food security crisis at this moment, and we're entering a year in which things will get more difficult. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that's exacerbated the situation. But I do want to stress that this was sort of in motion before all of the other events that have happened in the world this year. So we're looking at the effects of climate. We were looking at COVID, the pandemic, and how the effects on supply chains have influenced people's access to food. So I'll just stop there. I hope that helps.
Well, that helps very much. Thanks a lot for kind of bringing us into the basic a bit now. Dr. Watts, I believe you have a slideshow that you wanted to go through. Is that something you want to go ahead with?
Yeah, let's go ahead and open that up. Tell me if you can see it. Is that good?
Not yet.
No. Okay, let's try again.
Let me make sure you are co-hosted. There it comes. So there it is. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Okay, so again, I want to say thank you very much to the Montana World Affairs Council for your invitation to speak today. I'm really excited to be with you this afternoon. The U.S. Institute for Peace, which I understand co-sponsors World Quest, is actually right next door to the U.S. State Department headquarters here in D.C. So I walk by it every time I'm in the office. But I wasn't familiar with the competition before preparing for this talk. And from what I've read, combating food insecurity is just one of a range of really challenging topics. So I just wanted to commend you all. I'm very impressed by your curiosity and your dedication to learning about these subjects in more depth. And I hope that the talk can be helpful to you today. So my goal is really to make the subject of global food security a little more real for you. To tell you about the role that the State Department is playing in the current global food security crisis, and to answer any questions you may have. I'll also suggest some additional sources at the end in case you do want to look. I took a look at your study guide, and I thought the sources that are included in there are just fantastic. So they did a really good job. If you have additional questions, though, I do have some places where you could sort of go and poke around. But first, I just want to give you a brief introduction of my office and the State Department. So I'm part of what we call AGP, which is the Office of Agricultural Policy. It's within the State Department. We have a bureau that we sit in called the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. So those are a lot of words, and you see them on the slide. But what that means is we really interact within the Bureau with economic officers all over the world, with folks who specialize in bilateral trade and multilateral trade. It's really, I really would say if you're interested in foreign policy, the State Department, being a foreign policy expert has been just a tremendously rewarding experience for me. So highly recommended. Within our office, we have three primary areas of focus. So agricultural trade, that's the team that I'm generally on, biotechnology and food security, with sort of aspects of climate interwoven throughout all of those. I will say that the food security crisis that's sort of been worsening over the year has taken a lot of our time, even those of us who weren't on the food security team initially. Just so you know, I'm a veterinarian by training. I think that was mentioned. And other aspects that I focus on are food safety and animal health. Our office works closely with others within the State Department, both in Washington and at our embassies across the globe on agricultural and food security issues. We also collaborate with other government organizations like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, what you know as USDA. You probably know that well, since Montana has a fair amount of agriculture. Also here in DC is the USAID, which provides development aid to other countries, and the U.S. Trade Representative, or what we call USTR. So we work with all of those depending on the issue. and we sort of connect them to our country experts within the State Department who work with the embassy. So we sort of serve as a go-between and a one-stop shop for anything that has to do with agriculture at the State Department. We also interact with governments of other nations, multilateral organizations like the UN, and various non-governmental organizations as well. Okay, so on this slide, you'll see some numbers that you may recognize if you've looked at your study guide. Right now, we are very keenly aware of how food insecurity is rising around the world. As I mentioned earlier, it's been driven by armed conflicts, the COVID pandemic, extreme weather events like droughts and floods we've seen recently, accelerating climate crisis and high energy costs, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then this has been exacerbated by Russia's brutal war against Ukraine. So even before that, between 2016 and 2021, and you'll see this bar chart on the right, the number of people living in acute food insecurity, which is the level when that person's ability to consume adequate food, it puts their lives or their livelihoods in immediate danger, their sort of lack of access to food. So that has skyrocketed just since 2016. So perhaps when you guys were in middle school, it has skyrocketed from 108 million people to 193 million people. And there are estimates we've seen from the World Bank that this war is going to add or drive 40 million additional people worldwide into extreme poverty and food insecurity this year. So why? Why is that? Sorry, I lost a slide. Okay, well, I'll talk a little bit about why that is. So Russia and Ukraine normally export around 30% of the world's wheat and barley in global trade, 1/5 of the trade in maize, or what we call corn, and over half of the trade in sunflower oil. The region is also a major supplier of agricultural inputs. So when I say agricultural inputs, I'm talking a lot about fertilizer. There are 3 main types of fertilizer. I actually focus on fertilizer for the office, so I could talk about fertilizer for a long time. But we have potassium. So from that region, 37% of the world's potassium-based fertilizer exports, 15 to 20% of nitrogen, and also the third one, the phosphate-based fertilizer. Russia is now slowing Ukrainian exports and imports of needed goods, which makes it more difficult to get Ukrainian food supplies to the world market. And I'm sorry I don't have this slide on, but what I wanted to show you and what I suggest you look at is the UN Food and Agriculture. They do this food price index that they release periodically, right? And so there's this graph that shows that there was this huge spike earlier this year. Since then, food prices have fallen to about where they were in the same period last year, which is good news. But the overall global measure, if you just look at that one graph, it sort of masks a very serious food price inflation that certain regions are experiencing. It really depends on where you live. So we do see increases in our food costs. But just to give you some context, so in low income and middle income countries, so 84% of low income countries and 93% of what we call lower middle income countries and 93% of what we call upper middle income countries have seen inflation levels above 5%. So you guys are smart, you know that means the price of the same food has increased by 5%. And then there are some countries where you actually see double-digit inflation, so over 10%. And if you look at sort of the countries that are in our cohort, high-income countries with like the really high food price inflation, about 85% of those countries are also experiencing these effects. So, you know, that's a big deal. And the next slide sort of gives you some sense of that. So within your source list is the World Food Program. They're a very trusted partner for the US government. They sit within the UN and they deliver food to populations in crisis. They tend to source their food from local sources, which is great. So definitely look at their website, but just to give you a sense of the countries that are experiencing this crisis, if you look to the right with Africa, you can see the darker red. The countries in Africa and the Near Eastern region were already, a lot of them, food insecure, had fragile economies, but they were also, unfortunately, among the most vulnerable to supply chain disruptions from the Black Sea region. So what I'm talking about with Russia and Ukraine, and they are the most affected by the current crisis. Many governments in these regions, they lack enough resources to either purchase food at current prices or offer long-term subsidies to their people and producers, which would help them pay for the food with the high prices. So we worry that inflation of staple goods, what we call staple goods like maize and corn and wheat, as the prices go up, we worry about widespread protests, political unrest, and just suffering, right? I mean, it's the humanitarian aspect that really concerns us. In many countries, especially in Africa, rising prices are problems for both food security and what we call macroeconomic stability. So the food price inflation sort of previews shocks to a balance of payments and increasing domestic debt within these countries, which can create a cycle of further debt. Now, you may have seen the news this week that President Biden, starting today, is hosting the Africa Leaders Summit here in Washington. And I believe nearly 50 countries from the continent are going to be represented. So there's a lot of buzz around here. Food security will definitely be an important topic for discussion, as well as I've mentioned a little bit, the climate adaptation of agricultural systems. Many countries have raised concerns that rising fertilizer prices will affect their productivity within the country, and especially next year is what we're worrying about. Low affordability and low availability of fertilizer around the world. And one of the reasons behind the high fertilizer prices is that natural gas, which was coming out of Russia into Europe, is a major input for nitrogen-based fertilizer. So as the cost of natural gas has risen, some European fertilizer producers have actually had to shut down their plants. And you could sort of search around the news and see those articles. Because of those constraints and uncertainty about supplies of agricultural inputs, some farmers are reportedly choosing to plant substitute crops such as barley, which need less fertilizer, or not use fertilizer, or depending on where they are, not plant at all because they see that the return on the investment is just not there. So the US government is very concerned about this. We're working on a comprehensive strategy for fertilizer to increase production and get better distribution, increase efficiency. So I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about our lines of effort. This graph also refers to both fertilizer and food. And it refers to what we call export restrictions or export bans. We initially saw this more in Europe and the Middle East, and now it's sort of spread to other regions. But it's mainly focused on grains and oil seeds. And you can see they've just been going up in number over time. You can see the red line representing Russia's invasion of Ukraine that sort of threw world food markets into chaos. A lot of countries started to put these bans into effect then. And, so basically they are not allowing their companies to trade certain food and agricultural products with other countries in an attempt to build up their own food supply and reduce prices for their people. But the problem is that we know from experience, we've had a food crisis, another food crisis back in 2008 and 2009, that bans like this tend to create panic. They distort the world market, so it's hard to predict prices, which is never good. And as a result, the United States discourages countries from enacting export restrictions. So just to put it simply, we support open, fair, and transparent trade that's as predictable as possible for our farmers and our consumers. And we think that strengthens food security around the world. And I apologize, this graph is a little bit dated, but as of November 28th, according to the World Bank, 19 countries have implemented 23 food export bans, which means banned altogether to send that food out of the country. And then 8 have implemented 12 export limiting measures, meaning they might set an amount that can go out. So given the context of all of this, the what is happening and so what, why is it important? I want to tell you what we're doing, what the United States is doing to promote global food security, because we really feel like we're at an inflection point, and that inflection point can only be addressed effectively through really targeted, deliberate international action with partners. So we have been working with our partners and our allies since this spring, as well as with the international financial institutions. And we all put together these 5 sort of critical lines of effort to organize what we're doing and make sure that all aspects of the crisis were being addressed. So you can read this first line of effort. And all of these, just so you know, are also available on the State Department website. I have a link at the end to something called, I think it's called the Chair Statement, the roadmap, and that's what these 5 are. So the first one is sort of talking about, acute humanitarian needs. These countries that really need food right away, don't have time to wait for future planting seasons for their own agricultural systems to be strengthened, although that's important too. So we've really been trying to mobilize money to go to humanitarian organizations such as the World Food Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, that UNICEF, for example. These organizations are all at the front lines of responding to this crisis. And they are the ones that can reach populations that are being impacted. So when we've been trying to bring more money in, we really stress that the resources have to be additional on top of what we've already committed. President Biden, if you go back through the White House fact sheets, you'll see we've made several announcements throughout the year. First at a UN food security ministerial that Secretary Blinken hosted at the Summit of the Americas this summer, an additional $360 million for food security in the region. At the United Nations General Assembly just a couple months ago, President Biden announced over $2.9 billion in new assistance for global food insecurity, and that announcement built on $6.9 billion that had already been committed this year. So that just gives you some sense of sort of the magnitude of response that we see is necessary. We are also promoting trade finance and credit guarantee mechanisms to facilitate imports by vulnerable countries amid rising prices. So this means we're encouraging international financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, to help small and medium scale enterprises to pay for their imports of food. And we have done this in past crises and with past commodity price surges successfully. Not on this slide, but just to mention, because it has been a big deal, and you've probably seen it in the news, the Black Sea Grain Initiative. During this war, there had been Black Sea trade or shipping disruption. We could not get some of the food that Ukraine has produced out of the country fast enough. So, there was a lot of effort to get it over land through trains, and that effort was actually quite successful. But also, in addition, the United Nations and Turkey were able to broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia to allow a humanitarian shipping lane out of the Black Sea. This deal was renewed on November 17th. It had been set to expire and is now extended for another 120 days. And the United States strongly supports continued implementation of the initiative. Although it's enabled some grain exports out of Ukraine, I will say that overall, their grain exports remain well below the pre-war levels, and Russia does continue to make it difficult to allow ships to get to world markets. So as a result, the Ukrainian farmers have actually reduced, the amount of crops that they've been planting because they are not wanting to take a loss, understandably. I've already talked a little bit about the global fertilizer shortage, so I won't belabor this, only to say that USDA has a $500 million grant program to boost fertilizer production here in the United States. Also, Secretary Vilsack announced at COP27 in Egypt last week that we had successfully raised over $125 million to support President Biden, what we call the Global Fertilizer Challenge. So this funding is really to support fertilizer efficiency practices and alternatives. So it's good for the climate, it's good for the farmers. And we are hoping that other countries will even add to that and help incentivize their producers to maximize efficiency as well. I'm going to skip on to our third line of effort. So this one really has to do with longer term sustainability, capacity, and resilience in these vulnerable countries. So we are leveraging our bilateral assistance, meaning from the US to direct to countries, to address sort of critical investments in long-term food systems transformation. A key program here is USAID's Feed the Future, which really addresses the root causes of hunger and poverty. It boosts agriculture-led growth, resilience, and nutrition in countries in need. And that's funded at more than $1 billion a year. And they really give some technical expertise. They work in over 40 countries. So that has been really a proven success for us. And then in addition, as I mentioned, we work through these multilateral initiatives with many countries to try to increase food security resilience. And that includes increasing what we call smallholder farmer productivity, storage capacity, local food production, things like that. And the multilateral initiatives help us to coordinate our efforts with those of other donors, okay? So because it's important that we don't duplicate each other's work and sort of reinvent the wheel, right? Our fourth line of effort is really sort of shoring up social safety nets for folks that are vulnerable using the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and multilateral development banks. So this is really to help the poorest people cope with rising food prices and if they're farmers or producers with decreased incomes if their production has gone down. So this can take the form of cash, of food transfers. There is, if you look online, an International Financial Institution Action Plan for Food Security. So that will really give you a sense of what this is. That was released on May 18th, and our Secretary Yellen had a lot to do with that. So I hope you take a look. The World Bank Group has done a lot. They've made $30 billion available over a period of 15 months, looking at agriculture, nutrition, social protection, water, irrigation. So if you go on their website and you sort of Google World Bank Food Security Update, you can see details of that and some of the countries that they're helping. Okay, and then finally, this is our last line of effort, and I'd love to take some questions. We are working through multilateral forums to really sustain the political engagement over time with this issue, right? It's not just the issue of the day. As I mentioned, we're looking to 2023. And we really need to scale up our support. Everybody needs to be on board. So we've used the UN, our G7, our G20, the Food and Agriculture Organization, even such organizations as the International Maritime Organization, the African Union, the European Union, really to emphasize the importance of taking these proactive steps to respond to food security challenges and to help with the resilience, to discourage export bans, as I mentioned earlier, and work together to end Russia's war. That is really adding to these disruptions. So I think I'll stop there. If I had more time, I would tell you about some of these engagements that we did, including the May 18th Food Security Ministerial. Our Secretary Blinken and President Biden continued this work through G7, G20, the Summit of Americas, COP27, what we call UNGA, which is the UN General Assembly in New York. And then, yeah, I guess I'll stop there. And then if you're interested, I can tell you a little bit about sanctions, because you may also see that in the news and may have some questions about that. Okay.
Well, Dr. Watts, thank you so much for that insight. And it's just packed full of great stuff for students who are preparing for Academic World Quest in the spring. I'm just going to kick it off by asking you something a little bit closer to home for our students across Montana. Here in Montana, of course, we're both the producers and consumers of a global food commodity. So, can you tell us a little bit about how food security and the situation that you've described so well in the world has an effect on Montana's farmers and ranchers who are also part of the global system?
Yes, definitely. That's an excellent question. I have a particular lens that I jump to first, which is that of fertilizer. The fertilizer affordability and availability is definitely affecting U.S. farmers, in addition to farmers around the world, in other countries. And that has to do with, for example, the conflict. So the natural gas piece that I mentioned, but also Russia has instituted some export restrictions with fertilizer, which is not helpful. They are a major producer of fertilizer, including potassium. They're number 2 for our potassium or potash fertilizer that farmers need. So you do see the price impact of that in our local regions. And that ties in as well to some of the climate or weather events that we've been talking about, because of course, some of these factors sort of can exacerbate, each other. And that is something that we also watch very closely.
Can I just pick up on that quickly, Dr. Watts?
Sure.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation the factors leading to food insecurity, and climate being one of them. Montanans have a big interest and a big stake in our clean air, clean land, clean water, and we're interested in climate issues. Can you maybe dig down a little bit more on that? How exactly does climate change impact global food security?
Oh, wow. It's a great question. There are a lot of resources out there that are looking at this, and including, the international group that releases reports on climate change. They always have an agriculture section in which they are able to make predictions, based on the predicted rise in temperature. around the world. As a veterinarian, the one aspect that I see, and that's very difficult to see, is the impact of drought, for example, on pastoral communities and on, you know, livestock herders in general, because there are areas of the world where, you know, they don't have as good access to fresh water, where it's sort of impacting the animal's ability to access feed. Other, you know, areas, as I mentioned, you know, we've seen like flooding, for example, in Pakistan recently had a huge loss of agricultural products from flooding. We have many tools to address that. So, you know, one tool that my office is really involved in is looking at the promise of innovative technologies such as biotech. So there are seeds that are climate resilient, that are drought resilient, that you can use to efficiently sort of meet the needs of farmers who are living in areas experiencing this impact.
Thanks for that. I'm just going to point out we've got some students from St. Ignatius on the line. So if you have any questions, you can chat them into me, or you can just come to flip your microphone on and ask Dr. Watts directly. I do have another question in the chat from a good friend of ours and former staff member of the World Food Program. He asks, what would you advise young people interested in working for a U.S. agency on food security? What's out there for kids who are interested in pursuing a career in these issues?
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite parts of my job, is interacting with all of the agencies within the U.S. government who are working hard on this issue, and who are really dedicated for the right reasons, right? So we interact a lot with USAID. So if you're interested in more direct assistance, working with countries, actually seeing the impacts on the ground, I think USAID is a great place to look at. I put in that slide an interview with the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, who talks about their work. That's a great place to start to learn more about the agency. If you are more sort of farm focused, you know, USDA has foreign service officers who live overseas sometimes, and who are able to help us with agricultural trade issues. That's a really interesting and important job, opening up markets for US farmers, but also sort of getting to see on the ground in other countries how these systems function. If you're more interested in sort of econ and trade, the US Trade Representative. But of course, state for me is the mecca, because you get to do it all. You really get to do it all. And I am here in DC, so I am not a foreign policy officer, and I won't be traveling, but I do get to go out to countries and interact with governments, and it's just really fascinating, rewarding work.
Well, that's great when you say, you know, you can do it all. That's a wonderful way to answer that question. I'll just remind participants, particularly students, if you're interested in international careers, join us in February. We're going to have a week-long career fest online, where we're bringing people from all over the world who do all kinds of different jobs. Some like what Dr. Watts does at the U.S. Department of State, humanitarian aid workers, teachers, military people, you name it. If you have an interest in learning more about how you can work and live and have a career overseas, check us out in February. Let me quickly thank a few of the very generous sponsors who help us bring Academic World Quest to Montana. That includes the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, QFI, and Longview Foundation, and a list as long as my arm and leg of others who help us bring this and many more programs across Montana. Dr. Watts, thank you so much for joining us. Hugely insightful.
No, it's my pleasure. And good luck to all the students. I know you're going to do great. And good luck in your future endeavors. Real
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be with you.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much, Dr. Watson. Of course, for all participants in our webcast, the open invitation to come to Montana and speak to us directly is always there. So consider yourself invited to the big sky. And until then, I'm going to say thank you to you, Dr. Watts. Thanks to all of the participants. Thank you to the U.S. Department of State. Everybody, see you next time. Be well. Bye-bye.